He woke up early that morning, just as the first light began to peek through his bedroom window. The air was cool, and the faint sound of birds filled the silence of his small home. He had lived alone for years now, ever since his wife passed away, but he had grown used to the quiet. Some days he even found comfort in it. His mornings followed a routine that hadn't changed in years. He brewed his black coffee, put on his worn-out army jacket, and stepped out to the porch to watch the world wake up. The jacket wasn't just a piece of clothing for him. It was a reminder of who he once was, of the things he had done, and of the friends he had lost along the way. It was the only thing that made him feel like those years still mattered. That morning felt different, though. He didn't know why, but there was a strange restlessness inside him. After finishing his coffee, he decided to go into town. He hadn't been to the diner in weeks, and he missed the smell of freshly cooked eggs and the sound of the waitress greeting regulars like old friends. So he grabbed his car keys and headed out. The drive into town was peaceful. The road was lined with trees, their leaves beginning to turn shades of gold and brown. The breeze coming through his open window carried the smell of pine and dust. He tapped his fingers lightly on the steering wheel, humming a tune he couldn't quite remember the words to. When he pulled into the diner's small parking lot, he noticed something unusual. Lined up along the curb were 5 or 6 large motorcycles, each one shining under the morning sun. Their chrome parts gleamed, and the roar of one engine starting up echoed through the air. He could tell right away they weren't from around here. He parked his old pickup truck a little distance away and sat there for a moment, watching. The riders were gathered outside, talking and laughing loudly. They wore matching leather jackets with patches stitched across the back, something about Steel Brothers, or maybe it said Road Kings. He didn't look long enough to be sure. He wasn't intimidated, not really, but he knew the kind. Young men full of energy, trying to show off in front of each other. He turned off the engine, took a deep breath, and stepped out. As soon as his boots hit the pavement, a few heads turned his way. Maybe it was the old jacket, or maybe it was just the way he carried himself, straight-backed, calm, and quiet. He gave a polite nod as he passed them and walked toward the diner door. Inside, the atmosphere was different than usual. The regular crowd was there, but everyone seemed quieter than normal. The bikers had taken up most of the seats near the front windows, their loud laughter filling the room. The waitress behind the counter looked relieved when she saw him. She smiled weakly, like she was happy to see a familiar face among the noise. "Morning," he said softly as he took a seat at the counter. "Morning," she replied, almost whispering. "Coffee?" "Please," he said. She poured him a cup and leaned closer. "They've been here since sunrise," she said quietly. "Making a lot of noise, but so far no trouble." He nodded. "It's fine," he said. "They'll tire themselves out soon." He wasn't a man who liked to complain. Over the years, he had learned that silence often carried more power than words. He sipped his coffee, trying to focus on the taste rather than the laughter behind him. It didn't take long before one of the bikers noticed him. A tall, broad man with a tattoo running down his arm looked his way and smirked. "Hey, Grandpa," the man said loudly, his voice carrying across the room. "That your truck outside? Looks like it's older than you are." The veteran didn't respond. He kept sipping his coffee, pretending not to hear. Another voice joined in. "Nice jacket," someone said mockingly. "What's that, from the war?" A few of them laughed. The waitress looked uncomfortable, but she didn't say anything. She had seen enough over the years to know when to stay quiet. The veteran turned slightly, his expression calm. "Just having breakfast," he said simply. "Not looking for trouble?" "Trouble?" The tall biker grinned and stood up, walking over to him. "Nah, we're just talking. You can take a joke, right?" The veteran looked up at him, his eyes steady, his voice quiet. "I can take a lot of things," he said, then turned back to his plate. The biker hesitated, thrown off by how calm the old man was. He expected anger or fear, not this quiet confidence. But instead of backing off, he chuckled and went back to his seat. The laughter resumed, but it sounded a bit forced now. Minutes passed. The veteran ate slowly, ignoring the noise. But it wasn't over yet. As he stood up to leave, one of the bikers near the door blocked his way. The man grinned, arms crossed. "Hold up, old-timer. You're not leaving without telling us where you served. Maybe we'll buy you a drink for the stories." The veteran looked him in the eyes. "Not today," he said softly. The biker leaned in closer. "Come on, we're just being friendly." The veteran didn't flinch. His calm made the biker uneasy. The diner had gone completely silent now. Even the clinking of dishes had stopped. Everyone was watching. The leader of the group stood up again and joined the man blocking the door. He bent down, picked up the veteran's hat from the counter, and tossed it onto the floor. "Guess you dropped something, soldier," he said, his voice thick with sarcasm. The veteran stared at the hat for a moment. Then slowly he bent down and picked it up. He brushed off the dust and placed it back on his head. When he looked up again, his expression hadn't changed. But there was something in his eyes, something that made even the loudest man in the room take a step back. "You boys enjoy your breakfast," he said quietly. Then he walked out. No one stopped him this time. Outside, the sunlight was bright and the air felt heavier somehow. He walked to his truck slowly, his steps measured. He could still hear the faint noise from inside the diner, but it didn't bother him anymore. He opened the truck door, sat down, and took a moment to think. He wasn't angry, just disappointed. Not in them, but in how the world had changed. When he was young, respect meant something. Even if people disagreed, there was still a sense of decency. But now it seemed like some folks had forgotten what it meant to be humble. He pulled out his phone. The screen lit up, showing only a few saved numbers. Most of the people he once called friends were gone now, scattered across the country or lost to time. But there was one number he hadn't dialed in a long while. It was saved under the name Chief. He hesitated, then smiled faintly and pressed the call button. The phone rang once before a voice answered on the other end. "Sir? It's been a while," the veteran said. There was a pause, then the voice on the other end chuckled warmly. "Too long. What can I do for you?" "Nothing much," the veteran replied. "Just thought I'd say hello. Though I happen to be at a diner where a few young men could use a lesson in manners." The tone of the man on the other end shifted slightly, respectful, alert. "Understood," he said. "Where are you?" The veteran gave the name of the town, the small diner by the main road. "Don't make a fuss," he said calmly. "Just a friendly visit." "Got it," the voice replied. The veteran smiled and ended the call. He leaned back in his seat, the sound of motorcycles still faintly audible through the window. He didn't want trouble and he didn't want revenge. He just wanted to remind those men that not everyone they mock is weak. He looked out across the road, watching a few cars pass by, and let out a long breath. His mind wandered to his old comrades, men who had faced real danger, who had stared death in the eyes and still found the courage to stand tall. Compared to that, a few loud bikers didn't mean much, but he also knew something they didn't. Sometimes real strength doesn't come from shouting or fighting. It comes from quiet control, the kind that makes others realize they've gone too far without you ever raising your voice. As the sun climbed higher, he started the truck and sat quietly, waiting. He didn't know what would happen next, but he didn't worry either. He had faced far worse things in his life. A few minutes later, the distant sound of engines faded, replaced by the low hum of approaching vehicles. Cars, not bikes. He saw black SUVs pull into the lot, and a few men in plain clothes stepped out. The veteran smiled faintly. He didn't need to say a word. The world had its own way of setting things right. He stayed inside his truck, hands resting on the steering wheel, as the men walked toward the diner. Inside, the laughter had already started to fade. He didn't plan to watch. He just looked out at the open road, calm and steady like he always was. The past had taught him one thing. Sometimes silence speaks louder than any voice ever could. The door of the diner opened with a faint creak as the men in plain clothes stepped inside. Their presence was quiet but powerful. They weren't wearing uniforms, yet something about the way they moved told everyone they were not ordinary visitors. Their calm confidence filled the room like a wave that instantly silenced every laugh. The bikers looked up, confused. A few of them exchanged glances, trying to figure out what was happening. The waitress froze behind the counter, unsure whether to speak or stay quiet. She had never seen men like these before. Polite, but carrying an invisible authority that made everyone else in the room straighten up. The leader of the group of bikers leaned back in his chair, trying to keep his cool. "What's this?" he asked, his tone casual but his voice slightly nervous. One of the plain-clothed men walked over to the counter and greeted the waitress with a nod. "Ma'am," he said gently, "we're just here to speak with someone." He looked around the room, then his eyes landed on the veteran's empty seat. He noticed the half-finished cup of coffee and the untouched slice of pie next to it. He gave a small nod to one of the others, then walked toward the door, peeking outside. The veteran was still sitting in his truck, the morning sun reflecting off the windshield. The man stepped out, walked over, and tapped lightly on the window. The veteran looked up and smiled faintly before rolling it down. "Sir," the man said with a respectful nod. "We came as soon as we could." "Didn't expect you to move this fast," the veteran replied with a calm smile. "I just wanted to have breakfast," the man returned the smile. "And you will, sir. We'll handle this." The veteran shook his head slightly. "No need for trouble. They're just young and loud. Sometimes people need a reminder, that's all." The man nodded. "Understood." He turned to another one of his team, gave a subtle signal, and they entered the diner again. Not aggressively, just with quiet purpose. Inside, the bikers were restless now. The laughter was gone, replaced by an uneasy silence. The leader tried to play it cool. "What's this about?" "We didn't do anything wrong." The plain-clothed man looked at him and said calmly, "No one said you did, but I think you owe someone a bit of respect." The biker frowned. "Respect? What are you talking about?" The man nodded toward the window where the veteran's truck could still be seen. "That gentleman you mocked, you know who he is?" The biker stayed quiet. The leader gave a small smirk, pretending not to care. "Some old guy in a jacket." "What about him?" The man's tone didn't change, but his words carried weight. "That old guy led missions most of us wouldn't survive a day in. He's the reason a lot of people like you even get to ride freely down these roads." The room stayed silent. No one dared to move. The waitress watched from behind the counter, her eyes wide but filled with quiet relief. She didn't fully understand what was happening, but she could tell the men in suits were there for the right reason. The biker leader shifted uncomfortably. "We didn't mean anything by it," he muttered, but his voice had lost its confidence. The man in plain clothes didn't respond right away. He looked around the table, studying each of them. "Maybe not," he said softly. "But words have power. So does silence. You picked the wrong man to test today." One of the younger bikers at the table looked down, fidgeting with his napkin. He was starting to feel the shame settle in. It wasn't just the presence of these men. It was the sudden realization that they had crossed a line they didn't even see. Outside, the veteran sat quietly, watching the clouds drift across the blue sky. He wasn't looking through the window to see what was happening. He didn't need to. He knew the men he had once worked with. They understood how to handle things with dignity. He had made that one phone call not to punish, but to teach. He remembered the young faces of soldiers he had trained decades ago, men who once looked up to him the way sons look to fathers. He had seen courage, fear, pride, and sometimes arrogance too, but the best soldiers learned humility fast. He knew life had a way of doing that to everyone sooner or later. Back inside the diner, the air felt heavy. The bikers sat still, glancing toward the door. The man in plain clothes leaned slightly on their table. "You might not realize it," he said, "but the man you mocked has more honor in his silence than most people have in their entire lives." The leader cleared his throat. "We didn't know." "That's the point," the man said firmly. "You never know who you're talking to. That's why respect should come first." The man straightened up, then spoke softly to the waitress. "Sorry for the disturbance, ma'am." "You can go on with your day." She nodded, still speechless. The plain-clothed team walked back outside, calm as ever. As they reached the veteran's truck, the man at the front saluted quietly. The veteran returned the gesture with a small nod. No words were exchanged. There was no need. A few minutes later, the SUVs pulled out of the parking lot and disappeared down the road. The sound of their engines faded, leaving only the soft hum of the diner's air conditioner. Inside, the bikers sat in awkward silence. The leader finally leaned back and sighed. "Guess we messed up," no one replied. They all knew it was true. The waitress slowly walked over to their table. Her voice was calm but firm. "You boys want more coffee?" she asked. The leader looked up at her. "No, ma'am. We're good," she gave a polite smile. "Then maybe you should head out. Some folks like to eat in peace," they didn't argue. One by one, they stood up and walked outside. The leader was the last to leave, glancing once more through the window toward the veteran's truck. The old man was still sitting there, calm as ever, watching the horizon like a man who'd already seen everything there was to see. The leader hesitated for a moment, then walked over. He stopped a few feet away and cleared his throat. "Sir?" he began quietly. The veteran turned his head slightly, his eyes kind but steady. "Morning," he said. "I just wanted to say." "We didn't mean to disrespect you," the biker said awkwardly. "We were just fooling around." The veteran nodded slowly. "I know," he said. "That's why I didn't take it personally." The biker looked down. "Still, I'm sorry." The veteran smiled faintly. "Apology accepted." The biker looked relieved but still uneasy. "Those men who came in, they work for you?" The veteran chuckled softly. "No one works for me anymore. They're just friends. We've been through things together. The kind of things that make you family for life." The biker nodded slowly, understanding a little better now. "Must have been something," he said. The veteran looked off into the distance. "It was," he replied quietly. "And it still is in its own way." There was a pause. The biker took a step back. "Well, thank you," he said. "For everything." The veteran didn't answer right away. He simply nodded again, then turned his gaze back toward the open road. The biker walked away, his steps slower now, thoughtful. When he rejoined his group, they didn't say a word. They put on their helmets, started their bikes, and rode off one by one, the sound of engines fading into the distance. The veteran sat there a little longer. He wasn't proud or smug, just quietly content. He didn't want anyone to fear him. He only hoped those men would remember the moment and carry it with them. When the noise finally disappeared, he started his truck and drove down the road. The diner grew smaller in the rearview mirror, but he could still see the waitress waving from the door as he passed. He gave her a small nod and a smile before turning onto the highway. The wind blew through his open window, carrying the smell of fresh air and the faint scent of pine. He felt lighter now, like the day had given him back a bit of peace. He knew he'd stop by the diner again sometime, not to relive what happened, but because he believed people could change. Sometimes, one small moment was all it took to make a man rethink how he treated others. And deep down, he hoped that's exactly what those bikers were doing right then, riding down the long highway, a little quieter than before, replaying his calm voice in their heads, realizing that true strength doesn't always roar. Sometimes it simply stands still, steady as a mountain, letting the world learn its own lesson in silence. The afternoon sun hung low as the veteran drove slowly along the quiet road that led back to his home. The air felt warm now, and the sound of the truck's old engine blended softly with the rustle of leaves outside. He didn't rush. He had nowhere to be, and after the morning's events, he wanted time to think. He had seen many things in his life: battles, loss, friendship, and moments that tested every ounce of courage he had. But what happened at the diner reminded him that some lessons in life weren't about strength or survival. They were about humility, patience, and the quiet power of how one chooses to react. He thought about the bikers. They were young, full of fire and pride. He understood them more than they'd ever know. He had once been like that, bold, unshakable, believing the world owed him something. It wasn't until years later, after everything he'd been through, that he realized how small most fights really were. The road curved, leading him toward the open countryside. A line of telephone poles stretched far into the distance, and the golden fields glowed under the sunlight. He rolled down the window, letting the wind brush against his face. For a moment, he felt the same peace he used to feel back when he was stationed in quiet places overseas. The calm before the storm, the silence that made a man appreciate every breath. When he reached his driveway, he parked the truck under the shade of an old oak tree. The house was small but full of memories. Every corner carried a story: pictures on the walls, medals in a wooden box, and a shelf filled with letters from people he once served with. He walked inside, poured himself a glass of water, and sat by the window. The sound of crickets had already started outside. He watched the horizon, where the sun slowly began to dip lower, painting the sky with streaks of orange and pink. His phone buzzed lightly on the table. When he picked it up, he saw a message from the same number he had called earlier. "Chief." It read, "Everything handled. You did good today." He smiled faintly and replied, "Didn't do much. Just wanted to remind a few young men what respect looks like." He put the phone down and leaned back in his chair, thinking about how life had changed since his service days. Back then, everything was fast, intense, and loud. Orders came quick. Decisions had to be made in seconds, and Asian could cost lives. Now his battles were quieter, but the lessons were the same. Patience wins more than pride ever could. As evening settled in, he turned on the small radio on the counter. The soft hum of country music filled the room. He remembered the voice of one of his old friends, the same man he'd called earlier. They had served together for years, and despite all the time that had passed, their bond had never faded. He thought back to one mission that had changed everything for him, a time when they were deep in a dangerous zone overseas. His team had been surrounded, outnumbered, and exhausted. Panic had started to rise among the younger soldiers. But instead of shouting orders or showing fear, he had done something simple. He had sat down in the middle of the chaos, pulled out a small can of coffee from his pack, and started drinking it quietly. At first, everyone thought he'd lost his mind. But that small act, staying calm when everything around them was falling apart, had reminded his team that they still had control. Within minutes, they regrouped, planned their escape, and made it out safely. That memory came to him often, especially on days like this one. The diner incident wasn't life or death, but the principle was the same. Calmness can silence chaos faster than anger ever will. The next morning came early. He woke up before dawn as usual, brewed his coffee, and sat on the porch. The cool air brushed against his skin, and the world was still asleep. He thought about visiting the diner again, not to see what people were saying, but because that little place had become a part of his daily rhythm. When he arrived, the parking lot was nearly empty. The waitress was setting up inside, arranging chairs and wiping down tables. She looked up and smiled when she saw him through the window. "Well, look who's back," she said warmly as he walked in. "Didn't scare you off yesterday, did we?" He chuckled softly. "Takes a lot more than that to scare me." She poured him a cup of coffee and leaned on the counter. "You missed quite a show after you left," she said. "Those men looked like they'd seen ghosts. I don't know who your friends were, but they sure got quiet real fast." He nodded, keeping his tone calm. "They're good people. They just came to make sure everything was all right." The waitress smiled. "You've got some powerful friends." He took a sip of his coffee. "Not powerful," he said thoughtfully. "Just loyal. That's worth a lot more." The bell above the door jingled, and both of them turned their heads. To their surprise, two of the bikers from yesterday walked in. Their expressions were humble, their steps slower this time. The waitress froze for a second, unsure how to react. But the veteran just smiled faintly and nodded to them. "Morning," he said simply. They nodded back. "Morning, sir," one of them replied quietly. "We didn't expect to see you here again." He smiled. "Why not?" "I like the coffee." They both looked at each other, embarrassed but sincere. "We just wanted to say sorry again," the taller one said. "What we did was wrong. We acted stupid." The veteran studied them for a moment. There was no anger in his face, only a calm patience. "You've already said sorry," he said gently. "What matters now is what you do after." The shorter biker nodded. "We talked about it last night," he said. "You made us think. We've been riding together for years, but I don't think we ever really thought about what kind of example we were setting." The veteran nodded. It's never too late to start thinking about that. They stood there quietly for a moment before the taller one asked, "Can we buy you breakfast?" He smiled. "Only if you promise not to make fun of my truck this time." They laughed softly, the tension breaking. The waitress, who had been watching silently, finally relaxed and smiled. "You boys sit down," she said. "Coffee's on me today." As they sat together, something about the moment felt almost peaceful. The bikers asked him small questions, about the road, about his service, about life in general. He didn't talk much about the war itself, but he shared little lessons he had learned along the way. He told them how leadership wasn't about shouting louder than others, but about listening when no one else will. How strength doesn't come from being feared but from being respected, and how sometimes silence can be more powerful than any argument. The bikers listened carefully. There was something about the way he spoke, calm, steady but full of meaning, that made them want to listen. When breakfast was over, they stood to leave. The taller one extended his hand. "Thank you," he said sincerely, "for giving us a second chance to show we're not just fools on bikes." The veteran shook his hand firmly. "Everyone deserves a chance to do better," he said. They left the diner quietly, not on roaring engines this time, but with calm hearts. The veteran watched them ride away, and for the first time, he noticed they didn't race each other or make noise. They just rode steady side by side, like men who had finally found something worth respecting. The waitress came over holding the check he never paid for. "You know," she said softly, "I think you changed them." He smiled, looking out the window. "No," he said gently. "Life did. I just gave it a little push." She smiled back and nodded. "Well, whatever you did, it worked." He finished his coffee, left a few bills on the counter, and walked out into the sunlight. The wind carried the faint sound of engines fading in the distance, but it didn't sound harsh anymore. It sounded calm, like a promise of something better. As he stood by his truck, he took a deep breath and smiled to himself. The world had changed so much since his younger days, but one thing stayed the same. Respect was still the truest form of strength. And sometimes it took just one quiet moment to remind people of that. He got in his truck, started the engine, and drove off down the long road, the morning light shining across the fields. He didn't look back because he didn't need to. The lesson had already been left behind, in a small diner in a quiet town, where a few young men learned that real power doesn't come from noise, but from the calmness of a man who's already fought his hardest battles and lived to tell the story in silence. When the dark SUVs stopped outside the diner, every sound in the place seemed to fade away. The loud laughter, the clinking of cups, even the soft country song playing from the jukebox, all went silent. The bikers, who just moments ago were full of confidence and mockery, now stared through the glass with puzzled looks. They could see a few men stepping out of the vehicles. They weren't in uniforms, but something about the way they moved made it clear they were not ordinary people. Calm, alert, and professional. Inside, the air grew heavier. The waitress, who had been watching everything from behind the counter, froze in mid-motion, still holding a coffee pot. The veteran sat quietly near the window, his hands folded on the table. He didn't look nervous or angry or even satisfied. He just looked peaceful, as if he already knew how this would unfold. The first man from the SUV entered. He was tall, clean-cut, and carried himself like someone who didn't need to raise his voice to be respected. He looked around the diner, found the veteran, and nodded respectfully. The bikers exchanged glances, trying to figure out what was happening. The leader of the group straightened in his seat, trying to act unaffected, but a flicker of unease passed through his eyes. The man from the SUV walked up to the veteran and greeted him quietly. No titles, no loud gestures, just a firm handshake that spoke volumes. A few others followed him in, all showing the same quiet respect. One of them placed a hand on the veteran's shoulder as if saying, "We've got this." The veteran finally stood up. He didn't speak to the bikers at first. He exchanged a few calm words with the men who had arrived, then nodded. One of them turned toward the bikers and said in a steady voice, "Gentlemen, we need a word outside." The tone was polite, but it left no room for refusal. The bikers looked at each other again. The leader, trying to maintain his pride, let out a small laugh. "What's this about?" he said, forcing a grin. "We were just having lunch," the man replied. "Then we'll make it quick. Step outside, please." Reluctantly, the bikers got up. The leader hesitated, then motioned for his crew to follow. As they walked out, the other diners kept their eyes low. The waitress finally exhaled, whispering a quiet, "Thank goodness," under her breath. Outside, the air was crisp and quiet. The SUVs stood idling at the curb. The officers, or whatever they were, stood in a loose line, calm and confident. The bikers stopped a few feet away from them. The man who had first spoken looked at the veteran and said, "You want me to handle this, sir?" The veteran shook his head slightly. "No," he said. "I'll talk to them." He stepped forward, his boots making slow, steady sounds on the pavement. The bikers stood still, suddenly unsure of themselves. The leader tried to speak first, but his voice came out less steady than before. "Listen, old man, we didn't mean anything. Just some teasing." The veteran stopped in front of him and looked him straight in the eyes. It wasn't an angry stare. It was calm, steady, and heavy with something far deeper than anger. Experience. The kind of look that made a man feel seen even if he didn't want to be. "I know what teasing is," the veteran said softly. "What you did wasn't teasing. It was disrespect. And disrespect doesn't come from strength, it comes from weakness." The leader swallowed hard but didn't respond. The veteran went on. "You don't have to respect me. You don't even have to like me. But you should respect what you have. The freedom to sit here, to laugh, to live your life. That freedom isn't free, and one day when you grow older you'll understand how much people have paid for it." For a long moment no one spoke. The sound of the wind moved through the open street. The other men from the SUVs stood silently, watching but not interfering. Then one of the bikers, the youngest of the group, shifted awkwardly and said, "Wait. Who are you exactly?" One of the men from the SUV answered for him. "He's a retired commander," he said. "He led a special unit overseas for years. Most of us standing here today owe our lives to him." The words hit the group like a wave. The veteran didn't react. He didn't need to. His quiet demeanor already said everything. The leader's face went pale. "We didn't know," he muttered. "You didn't have to know," the veteran replied. "You just had to be decent." The leader looked down, his bravado completely gone. The others stayed silent, ashamed. One of the officers took a small step closer and said gently, "You boys might think you're tough, but you've never had to sleep in the dirt, wondering if you'll wake up. You've never carried someone out under fire, so maybe think before you laugh at the wrong person next time." The bikers nodded quietly. The leader opened his mouth again, but no sound came out. His pride had vanished, replaced by something heavier: guilt. The veteran sighed and said, "I'm not angry. I've seen worse than this. But you all need to understand, respect is not weakness. And kindness doesn't make a man soft. It takes more strength to stay calm than to start a fight." He turned slightly as if ready to leave, but then looked back at them one last time. "You called me Grandpa Soldier, that's fine. I've been called worse. But let me tell you something. Some of the strongest men I knew never came home to be called anything at all." That line landed hard. The bikers looked away, unable to meet his eyes. The man who had arrived with the SUV stepped forward, offering a small nod toward the group. "He doesn't hold grudges," he said. "But if I were you, I'd think about what kind of men you want to be from here on out." The leader finally found his voice again. "Sir, I'm sorry," he said, his tone low and sincere. The veteran simply nodded. "Then do better," he replied. After a long silence, the group slowly walked back to their bikes. None of them spoke. The sound of engines starting broke the stillness, and one by one they rode off, leaving only the faint smell of gasoline and shame behind. The veteran stood there for a moment, looking at the empty street. One of the officers came up beside him and said, "You handled that better than anyone else would have." The veteran gave a small smile. Sometimes silence says more than shouting ever could. They talked quietly for a few minutes about life, about old times, about how things had changed. The younger officers listened closely, almost in awe of the calm strength in his words. Finally, the veteran thanked them and told them to go back to their work. They insisted on giving him a ride home, but he refused, saying, "I drove here alone, I'll drive back the same way." When he walked back inside the diner, the atmosphere had completely changed. The customers, who had all stayed silent through the confrontation, now looked at him with newfound respect. The waitress hurried over, her eyes wide. "Sir, are you okay?" she asked. He smiled gently. "I'm fine. Just hungry." She laughed nervously and said, "Lunch is on the house today." He shook his head. "No, ma'am. Everyone pays their way." Then he placed a few bills on the counter. "But thank you." As he sat back down, the room slowly returned to normal. Conversations resumed, though quieter than before. The same people who had looked away earlier now couldn't stop glancing toward him. They didn't see an old man anymore. They saw someone who carried quiet power. The veteran didn't seem to notice. He simply ate his meal, enjoying the peace. When he finished, he left a small tip under his coffee cup and walked out into the bright afternoon light. Outside, the last SUV was still parked. The man who had spoken first gave him a small nod before getting in. The veteran nodded back and said, "Thank you, Chief." "Anytime, sir," the man replied. Then they drove off, disappearing down the road. The veteran stood for a moment, looking around the quiet street. The wind carried the faint sound of motorcycle engines far away in the distance. He smiled faintly, not because he'd won anything, but because he knew peace had been restored without anyone getting hurt. As he climbed into his truck, he looked at his reflection in the mirror and said softly, "You did what you had to do. That's enough." He turned the key, the engine rumbled to life, and he drove away toward the setting sun, just another man in a small town who happened to carry a history that few would ever understand. But for those who witnessed it that day, the story would never be forgotten. They'd remember how the bikers went silent, how respect was earned without a single shout, and how one quiet phone call reminded everyone that true strength doesn't need to prove itself. It simply is. The morning after the diner incident, the veteran woke up early as he always did. The world was quiet outside, the kind of calm that only existed at sunrise. He sat by the window with a cup of coffee, watching the soft light spread across the sky. Birds chirped and the street was empty except for a few joggers passing by. He didn't think much about what happened the day before. In his mind, it was already behind him. He had faced far tougher days in life. Yet something about the looks on those bikers' faces stuck with him. Not because he wanted to remember their shame, but because he hoped they'd learned something meaningful. As he sipped his coffee, he thought about how quickly people judged others these days. So many forgot that everyone carried stories, scars, and battles unseen. He'd learned long ago that pride often comes from fear, and arrogance usually hides insecurity. Later that morning, he stepped outside to pick up the newspaper. His neighbor waved from across the street and called out, "Hey, I heard what happened at the diner yesterday." "You all right?" The veteran smiled politely. "I'm fine. Just another day." But word had already spread around town. Small towns had a way of making stories travel fast, especially ones that carried a quiet lesson. Some people admired his calmness. Others felt embarrassed that no one had stepped in when the bikers were mocking him. He didn't hold it against anyone. He never expected others to fight his battles. He'd learned long ago that true strength wasn't about how loud you could be. It was about knowing when to stand tall and when to stay still. Later that afternoon, he went back to the same diner. He wasn't sure what kind of reaction he'd get, but he didn't want fear or awkwardness to change his routine. The bell above the door jingled as he stepped inside. The same waitress from the day before saw him and immediately smiled. "Good to see you again, sir," she said warmly. He nodded. "Good to be back." The place felt different this time, calmer, respectful. A few customers looked up when they saw him, and this time they nodded kindly. One even stood and pulled out a chair for him near the window. He thanked them and sat down. As he looked through the menu, the waitress leaned in slightly and whispered, "You know, those bikers came back last night." He looked up, a bit surprised. "Did they?" "Yeah," she said. "They came in quiet, didn't say a word. They asked if you were here. When we told them you'd already gone, they left a note for you." She handed him a small folded piece of paper. He opened it slowly. The handwriting was rough and uneven, probably written by the biker leader himself. It said, we were wrong. Thank you for teaching us something we didn't even know we needed to learn." The veteran smiled faintly. It wasn't about the apology, it was about the effort. The fact that they took the time to return, to reflect, and to admit their mistake meant something. It showed that change, even small, was still possible. He folded the note carefully and placed it inside his jacket pocket. "Thank you," he told the waitress. She smiled. "I think you made quite an impression on everyone, sir. People are talking about how you handled it. Most folks would have yelled or fought back." He chuckled softly. "Sometimes silence works better than shouting. Anger only spreads more anger." The waitress nodded thoughtfully. "I think you're right." He finished his meal quietly, paid his bill, and left a generous tip before heading out. Outside, he saw something unexpected. Across the parking lot, parked neatly beside his truck, were two motorcycles he recognized from yesterday. Two of the bikers were standing there, waiting awkwardly. When they saw him, they straightened up. They didn't wear their usual tough expressions. They looked almost nervous. The veteran stopped a few feet away and simply said, "Afternoon." The younger one stepped forward first. "Sir, we just wanted to apologize in person," he said quickly. "Yesterday, we acted like fools. We thought we were being funny, but we were just being disrespectful." The older one, who had been their leader, added, "We've been thinking about it all night. None of us slept, right? You didn't yell, you didn't threaten us, and somehow that made it worse. You made us see how wrong we were without saying much at all." The veteran studied them for a moment. He could see the sincerity in their faces. He knew they weren't just saying words, they meant it. "I appreciate you saying that," he replied gently. "What matters is not the mistake itself, but what you do after it." The leader nodded slowly. "We were out of line. We don't deserve your respect, but we hope you'll accept our apology." The veteran reached out and shook his hand. "You already did the hardest part," he said. "You came back.